to talk about three historians. And here they are. Great. Sorry, can you hear? Yes. Okay. And on the left is, on your right, is Margaret Macmillan, who's a Canadian historian. And this is her account of the 1919 conference in Versailles. And since then, she has published a book on the outbreak of the Great War in 1914. Although Canadian, she fell in love with Oxford, and Oxford fell in love with her, so she has come back to my Oxford College as head of it. It's nothing to do with the food. The catering is appalling, but apparently she likes other aspects of Oxford. Then, well known to you will be Christina Kersten, who was enormously helpful to me when I was beginning. Before she was published even abroad, I used to sit in her kitchen, and she had one of the old style duplicating machines. So we would sit there for 6 hours, and then some small pamphlet would come out. Okay, can you hear? Is everyone familiar with the best book on this subject, Narodziny systemu władzy polskiej? Does anybody not know it? I want to give it to somebody. Let me give it to you. And I also have many copies, well, not enough, but copies of my paper. Shall I give them out now? Okay, there we are. Now, my idea was to give a very broad picture. Obviously, I can't talk about 70 years of modern history in, how long, 25 minutes. So I just want to highlight and begin, as Margaret Macmillan does, with 1919. The copies of this paper are available online, so if 25 minutes is not enough and you want to read more, give me your email and I will simply forward it to you. The essential point about Versailles, in my opinion, is that they tried to create a new international system. You don't need to say to a Polish audience that the balance of power system was a disaster. It's the balance of power that enables 5. Technically, there need to be 5, actually. It doesn't work with 4 or 7, 5. And they, of course, as this audience doesn't need to know, divided the map of Europe between them. And the idea of Woodrow Wilson coming to Versailles is to create an international order on a different basis. And he borrows a phrase from Immanuel Kant, the League of Nations. And his idea is that instead of balance of power, to keep, instead of balancing power, which of course kept overbalancing, you would have collective security. Dziękuję bardzo. And I'm very reluctant to read to you because I don't like being read to unless it's a very nice child's story. On the other hand, this is unfair to the translators since I gave them what I would. And so in deference to the translators, I will start to read. But I think there's not time to read everything, so you can relax. It's not long. Woodrow Wilson comes to Europe with his famous 14 points. Yeah, so the second paragraph now. And point number 13, as you know, concerns Poland. An independent Polish state should be created. Perhaps should have said recreated, which should include the territory inhabited by indisputably Polish populations. Now, who is an indisputably Polish population? which should be assured access to the sea. Coming back to Gdansk reminds me of how important this is. I, at an early age, got to know about the port of Gdynia because my father-in-law was building it in the 1920s. He was an economist, well, initially an economist and then a technician. And the idea that Wilson has comes from Dmowski, that you should rebuild the Polish state on the whole national territory of Poland. Now, this no doubt is a subject that will come up in the next day or two, so I shall skirt around it tactfully now. Woodrow Wilson's idea is that every nation should have self-determination, whatever that means. And so states that had lost statehood, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, were recreated. New states were established, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. I use the past tense here since neither still exists, but they did exist from 1919-20. And this is perhaps beyond the theme of Europe, but many parts of the world were deemed not ready for statehood. They didn't use the word backward, but this is what they meant. They were too immature to become states. And they were to be prepared for statehood by those that were mature enough. This is the so-called mandates system. Much of my understanding of Poland comes from Oskar Halecki, and I'm very pleased to see he is now being published again. I now see him in Polish bookshops. And he's critical of the Wilsonian notion because it extends beyond the European and Christian traditions. And one of the reasons for giving you this is that there's a long list of footnotes at the end. I'm sorry, academics just produce this sort of apparatus. And so that's where the reference to Oskar Halecki. I read an English translation in 1950. He had considerable impact at that stage. Then after that, geopolitics sort of went out of fashion, as though somehow you could abolish geography, which of course is complete nonsense, so it's back in fashion now. Now, in order to talk about 70 years in 27 minutes, we have to jump forward. And I want to jump forward to FDR, Franklin Roosevelt's idea of a new international order. I'm not going to talk about Yalta, but you can see I'm creating a context here in which we start to think about Yalta. And his idea is that new states should be based on sovereignty. Now, this is a very difficult concept. I'm sure everyone has their own understanding of it. And perhaps to begin at the end, one has to admit, as international lawyers will, that sovereignty is a legal fiction. Yes? Sorry, I don't know. It's legalnie fiction. In other words, it exists, but, well, it doesn't really exist. And Chapter 1 of the United Nations Charter, the United Nations is Roosevelt's idea, says the organization is based on the sovereign equality of all its members. Well, since all sovereigns are equal anyway, what is this phrase, sovereign equality? Well, what is adding this word equality doing? And then, of course, Chapter 7, this is still the beginning of the UN Charter, it turns out 5 members of the UN are more sovereign than others. These are the permanent members of the Security Council. And they're given a veto, as you know, over the activity of the organization. And the reason they were given this was they otherwise would not have joined. The United States does not join the League because it feared, Congress feared being drawn into conflicts that were not in America's interests. In order that this wouldn't happen again in 1945, they were given a veto. Now, I'm very sorry our Russian colleague is not here, because I was hoping she might disagree with me. I have a rather I am a Russianist, so you'll find lots of Russian footnotes at the back of the paper. I have a rather simple, perhaps simplistic view of Stalin. I know he's a very complicated character with many difficult psychological problems, and I've left it on my chair, and Norman Naimark has written a wonderful book called Stalin's Genocides. Have you come across this? I don't know if it's in Polish yet, it should be. And more or less every nationality was subjected to genocide in one form or another. If it's your own nationality, you're very upset about it, of course. But bear in mind that, as this book demonstrates, nobody was safe. And in fact, even Stalin's Politburo was not safe. Khrushchev says in his memoirs, after an all-night party at Stalin's dacha, you never knew whether the car would take you home or straight to Lubyanka. And the more he knew people, the less he seemed to trust them. So Molotov, his number 2, his wife was sent to the Gulag for many years, as you know. And she's only released a week after Stalin dies. She becomes famous. She has a rather strange name, at least it's a strange name to me, Zhemchuzhina, and the Russians name a perfume after her. Sorry, that's an impromptu remark. I think perfume is probably the same word in Polish. I think there could have been 4 possible outcomes of the World War II for Poland. And I'd like to very briefly say what I think they are. First, of course, is Poland could be incorporated in a wider Soviet Union. This is what happens to the Baltic states. Communist leaders were often thought to be trying to create Poland as a new Soviet republic, although I very much enjoyed reading the archives immediately following Bierut's death. As you remember, he stays on after the 20th Congress in Moscow and dies in rather unexplained circumstances, probably because he was ill. But rumors in the Archiv Novak, wonderful time reading them, popular opinion took the view that Bierut had been murdered in Moscow because he refused to incorporate Poland in the Soviet Union. So incorporation. Secondly, a sort of Helsinki solution we could call Finlandization. In other words, Moscow controls the foreign relations, but the country itself has, if not sovereignty, at least statehood and ability to arrange its own affairs. A third option, none of these happen, of course, is neutrality. Austria becomes neutral in 1955. Hungary hopes to follow, but we know what happened to Hungary. And a final option, also, of course, that doesn't happen, is some sort of open relationship with the West. Stalin loses interest in Greece and Turkey in about 1947, or simply a division. Germany is divided into 4. Well, of course, the outcome for Poland is a bit of 1 and a bit of 2. It's partly incorporated, partly Finlandized. I think this, and I'm happy to be told I'm oversimplifying, but since I'm not absolutely sure I'm right, I'm going to quote, in my opinion, the best Russian historian of this period, called Sergei Kudryashov, who in one of the books that was mentioned has a chapter on Stalin's policy towards Poland. And he sees it as a fairly simple series of moves. Create an alternative government on Polish soil that's not troubled by the Katyn and other massacres. Recognition of this government by Moscow, and then following the Red Army's arrival, transfer of power to this new government. Point 4 is difficult and probably will lead to discussion, but probably not with me. Western agreement to simply moving Poland 200 kilometers. And both two sets of Russian records I have read, as well as foreign policy documents published in Washington in 1961, state that Roosevelt agreed to this. At a very early stage, that Poland would be moved to the West. But being a politician, and because he's intending to stand for a fourth presidency in 1944, he asks Stalin to keep this secret. And Stalin agrees, muttering to himself that Soviet foreign policy doesn't have these democratic constraints that make it all much too difficult. Roosevelt's motivation is fairly clear. There are 6 or 7 million American voters of Polish origin, and they would not be happy with this. And if someone would, in the remaining day and a half, tell me I'm wrong about this, then I'd be more than happy, because I much admire FDR in many respects. And I think his notion of a post-war order has, by and large, succeeded. We haven't had a Third World War, although we came close. But the outcome for Poland was not satisfactory. Sorry, I haven't numbered my pages, and I'm slightly confusing. But you will remember at Yalta there is an agreement on liberated Europe, which says that, and Roosevelt writes this to Stalin as well, as a result of our conference, we will hold free elections in Poland at the earliest possible date. This is a letter of March 1945. The earliest possible date, as you know, was 1989. So from the point of view of history, it's quite a short period. From the point of view of 2 generations of people living here, it was a very long wait. My own view, perhaps we might pursue this in discussion, is that although the geopolitics of the Cold War is established by Yalta and confirmed at Potsdam, it's not quite the same as saying a Cold War that we had is inevitable. I think Stalin was open to any sort of economic assistance that the West might provide. Every time he meets an American ambassador, he asks for something, a railway or military supplies and so on. And in the paper, I'm very interested to find that a Soviet economist, Yevgeny Varga, has a similar idea to the Marshall Plan, but a year earlier. And his idea is, so that Europe doesn't go back into a depression, it needs investment. Where can the investment come from? From the United States. American historians like to present this. I think Churchill, as usual, exaggerating, calls this the most generous act in history. Well, I think one doesn't need to be too much of an economist to realize it's not simply a generous act. If the world economy was to recover, which is what the US needed, Europe had to recover. And it could only recover if it was financed. And there's a further subclause to this that only when Germany can repay France and Britain for the war, reparations, could Britain and France repay the United States for what it had borrowed. So you just think of this as money comes to Europe and then it goes back to the United States. I'm not a great fan of economic determinism, but I draw this to your attention. I think I have 2 minutes left, which is not a lot of time to... if you'll forgive me, I'll now just summarize. I have got very interested in the idea of limited sovereignty. Phrase perhaps you've come across. When the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia in '68, American analysts said there is now a Brezhnev doctrine. And they point to an article in Pravda in September '68. What they don't mention, of course, is that America had had foreign policy doctrines since 1825, so it had taken the Soviet Union a long time to catch up. And this is something I'm working on, but perhaps not as relevant as it should be for today. If there was a Brezhnev doctrine, was it considered in 1980-81 as a basis on which the Soviet Union would invade this country? And one of the interesting conferences held outside Warsaw, oral history conferences, had the then commander of the Warsaw Pact, Marshal Kulikov. Do you remember him? By then he was 76 years old. He was covered in medals. He arrived with a staff of 5, one of whom was a valet to look after his uniform. And he was quite categorical on day one that there was no plan to invade Poland in 1980-81. By day 4, he'd slightly changed his tune, particularly after East Germans and others present said, well, what do you mean there wasn't a plan? Here it is, and we were going to take part. By day 4, he does admit, well, there was a plan, but I was watching him very closely at this point. But it was a political decision which was not taken. And perhaps I imagine it, but I think I saw a look of disappointment on his face. Professional disappointment. We could have done a really good job. We were all ready, but it was not our decision. Now, I've mentioned the Russian historian I most admire. The American I most admire is Mark Kramer at Harvard. And we're jointly doing a piece of work, which I think others will disagree with, but that's fine, on when the Brezhnev doctrine is finally rescinded. And we found documents from the Gorbachev archive from spring of 1989. One of Gorbachev's advisors in January '89 tells Gorbachev we should look into what our commitments are. And 2 months later, they formally rescind this doctrine of automatic invasion. And Gorbachev, being a rather remarkably open sort of politician, said, well, let's tell the Americans about it, then they can relax. And his advisors said, no, you can't possibly tell the Americans, because it will leak to the press. East Europeans will then read it and think, oh, the Americans and Russians are ganging up on us again. So it remains in the archives. The third person to draw your attention to is, this time an American, Mary Sarot, who, instead of writing books like all the rest of us on why 89, her book is about what happens afterwards. What are the options? I don't know if it's in Polish yet, it certainly should be. And, well, you know the outcome, of course, but what is interesting about her book, she's sadly gone back to California. Americans shouldn't be allowed to go back to California. They should stay in Europe. We can learn things from them. There were 4 possible options. Now, this is the very end of the paper. I'll try to rush through them. Simply go back to 1945, divide Europe between 3 or 4 superpowers. Chancellor Kohl has the idea of reviving the 19th century German Confederation. So all the German, or indeed the former German states would share a foreign policy, but continue to organize their own affairs as they want. Most mysterious of all, I've given up trying to understand Gorbachev, although it's lovely if you don't think about it. Gorbachev's solution was a common European home. Now, if somebody knows what that means, will they please explain it to me? It's not even a concept. I love the idea that in Europe we're all in it together. And by the way, the Americans could go home now, and Russia is no longer a threat because it's part of a pan-European security system. The outcome, of course, is none of these. It's simply that Western institutions move east. And so that from the Gorbachev advisors' generation, their worst nightmare has taken place. Namely, despite what happened in 1945, they now have the European Union and NATO on their borders. A very last point, if I may. Since '89, Poland has regained its sovereignty. And the essence of sovereignty is that international relations are not determined by force, but by negotiation and by consent. And I regret to say that this question of sovereignty is again topical, and I, of course, mean the Ukraine. Thank you.